lost. That's the only explanation I could come up with, standing there in the driveway of my own home, the home I spent 11 years building, not just with money, but with my own two hands, weekends on scaffolding, summers hauling stone from a quarry 40 minutes south of Asheville, watching my daughter carry a silver tray of champagne flutes toward a group of strangers in linen blazers who were laughing too loudly on what used to be my back porch. She walked right past me, didn't slow down, didn't look twice. Just kept moving with that careful, practiced walk of someone who has learned to be invisible in a room full of people who see through them. I stood there for a moment. The mountain air was the same, the smell of the ridge in late September, cedar and cool earth, and something faintly sweet from the apple trees I planted along the south fence in 2003. That was exactly the same, but my daughter was serving drinks to strangers at a wedding reception being held on my property, and she didn't know me. She didn't know me because she'd been told I was dead. Let me go back. My name is Eugene Calloway. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, most of that time running my own firm out of Asheville, North Carolina. I wasn't rich in the way people mean when they say the word carelessly. I was comfortable. I had built something real, a small company, a reputation, and a piece of land in the Blue Ridge Mountains that I purchased in 1991 for what felt like an impossible amount of money at the time and turned out to be the best decision I ever made. My wife, Susan, passed away from ovarian cancer in 2014. That loss changed the shape of everything. We had one daughter together, Renee, who was 26 when her mother died, newly married to a man named Philip, living in Charlotte, and I had a younger brother, a man I'll call Warren, who had spent most of his adult life borrowing against my goodwill the way other people borrow against their credit cards. A little at a time. Never enough to make a scene over. Warren was 4 years younger than me. He had worked in real estate, quit, tried restaurant ownership, failed, tried again in a different city with the same result. He was charming in the way that people who've never been held accountable tend to be. Easy smile, good stories, a talent for making you feel like you were both on the same team just before he needed something from you. I'd helped him more times than I could count. Not once did I do it expecting repayment. He was my brother, that was enough, or I thought it was. In January of 2018, I had a stroke. I was 58 years old, in good health by most measures, no family history of it that I knew of. I was alone in the house when it happened. A neighbor found me the next morning when she noticed my truck hadn't moved and the lights had been on all night. They flew me to the hospital in Charlotte, and from there I was transferred to a facility in Raleigh where the neurological team was better equipped. I was unconscious for 11 days. When I came out of it, I had significant damage to the left side of my brain. My speech was impaired. My right side barely functioned. The doctors told me I had a long road ahead. What they didn't tell me, what no one told me, was what was happening back in Asheville while I was lying in that bed. Warren had driven up within 48 hours of my stroke. He told the hospital staff he was my next of kin. Renee was listed as my emergency contact, but Warren told them she was unreachable, traveling internationally, and produced documents. I still don't know exactly what he brought or how he got them. That gave him temporary power of attorney. It took him less than 6 weeks to begin moving my assets. I spent 8 months in the Raleigh facility. My speech came back slowly. My right side came back even slower. I was making progress, but I was still largely dependent on staff for basic daily functions. Warren visited 3 times. Each time he told me not to worry. He told me Renee was handling things. He told me the firm was in good hands. He told me the firm was in good hands. He told me to focus on getting better. What he was doing, in fact, was dismantling everything I had built. He dissolved my company, liquidated the business accounts, sold the equipment and client files to a competitor for a fraction of their worth. He filed paperwork claiming I was permanently incapacitated, a legal determination that had not been made by any physician, and used that filing to transfer the deed on my astral property into a trust he controlled. He told Renee, my own daughter, that the doctors had said I would never recover, that I had, in fact, deteriorated and passed away in the spring of 2018. He told her I was dead. He attended a memorial service. I don't know who came. I don't know what was said. But Renee, grieving in shock, 29 years old and already worn down by the loss of her mother 4 years earlier, had no reason to question it. Warren was there. Warren handled everything. Warren told her that I had left the property to the family, that it was hers, that she and Philip could come live there if they wanted. What he didn't tell her was that he retained control of the trust, that he was the one deciding who could live there and under what conditions, that in the years that followed when Renee's marriage to Philip fell apart and she and her young son needed somewhere to go, Warren offered her the house, but only if she helped manage it, helped manage events, helped with the hospitality business he had opened on the property. My daughter, believing her father was dead, believing the house was her inheritance, moved in and became the de facto staff. She served drinks at his events, she coordinated vendors, she cleaned up after parties held in the home I built with my hands. And because Warren paid her a small wage and let her live there with her son, a boy I had never met, a child who was 2 years old when all of this started, she stayed. She didn't know she was being used. She thought she was surviving. She thought she was being taken care of by the only family she had left. What Warren didn't know was that I had been discharged. 18 months after my stroke, I was functional, not what I was before. My speech still had a slight drag on it, and my right hand tired quickly. But I could think clearly. I could walk. I could read contracts and understand them. The facility in Raleigh discharged me in the summer of 2019. I had no money. Warren had seen to that, but I had a friend, a man named Gordon Price, who had worked with me for 12 years at the firm, who let me stay with him in Durham while I figured out what had happened. It took time, more time than I want to admit. Gordon helped me navigate the records. What we found, piece by piece, was a picture that made me sick. The power of attorney filing was fraudulent. No physician had declared me permanently incapacitated. Warren had used paperwork from the early weeks of my hospitalization, when my status was genuinely uncertain, and had represented it as a final determination. The trust he'd created was structured in a way that technically appeared legitimate on the surface, but relied entirely on that fraudulent foundation. The deed transfer, the dissolution of the business, all of it. I found an attorney in Asheville named Harriet Odom who specialized in elder financial abuse and estate fraud. She looked at what I brought her and didn't say much for a long moment. Then she said, "Mr. Calloway, I need you to understand that this is going to take time, but I also need you to understand that what happened to you is one of the clearest cases of this kind that I have seen in 20 years of practice." We filed complaints with the North Carolina Secretary of State's office, the state bar. Warren had used an attorney whose involvement we needed to examine, and the Financial Crimes Unit of the State Attorney General's office. We filed a civil suit. We began the process of contesting the trust and the deed transfer, and we agreed on something together, Harriet and I. I would go to the property before any of it became public, not to confront Warren, not to make a scene, but to see my daughter. I drove up to Asheville on a Thursday in late September of 2022. Gordon drove. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the mountains come up out of the haze the way they always did on that stretch of I-40, that gradual sharpening, the blue-gray ridgeline rising until it was solid and real and all around you. I had been away for 4 years and 7 months. There was an event at the property, some kind of wedding reception. We had seen it advertised online. Warren had turned the place into a venue for hire. The parking area along the lower fence had 15 or 20 cars in it when we arrived. Gordon parked on the road. I walked up the gravel path alone. The house looked the same from the outside. Someone had painted the trim. The wrong color, a cool gray instead of the warm cream Susan and I had chosen. And there were outdoor string lights strung through the apple trees that I found garish, but the bones of the place were mine. The stone steps were mine. The timber framing of the porch, the proportions of the windows. I had drawn every one of those dimensions myself. A young woman in a white button-down shirt and dark pants came off the porch as I approached. She had a clipboard. She asked me pleasantly whether I was there for the reception. I didn't answer right away, because I had just seen, over her shoulder, through the open door at the far end of the porch, my daughter come out of the kitchen carrying a tray. Renee was 33 now. She had her mother's way of moving, precise, purposeful, a kind of economy of motion that Susan had had even when she was tired. Her hair was shorter than the last time I'd seen her. She was thinner than I remembered. She was crossing the porch and she looked up, probably because the young woman with the clipboard had stopped moving and was waiting for my answer. And for just a moment her eyes passed over me the way you scan a crowd, fast, indifferent, categorizing, and then she stopped. The tray tilted. She caught it before anything fell, but just barely. She stood there at a distance of maybe 30 feet and looked at me. The young woman with the clipboard looked back and forth between us. Renee said, very quietly, "That's not possible." I said, "It's me, sweetheart." She put the tray down on the nearest table. One of the guests looked up, then went back to their conversation. She walked toward me slowly, like someone approaching something they don't trust their eyes about. She stopped a few feet away. She said, "They told me you died." I said, "I know." She made a sound I cannot describe accurately. It wasn't a cry, exactly. It was something that had been held in for a very long time and had no name. She put both hands flat against my chest, as if she needed to verify I was solid, that I had weight and warmth and was genuinely there. And then she held on. We stood like that on my porch, on the porch I had built, while someone's wedding reception continued around us, and string lights moved gently in the mountain breeze. And I let my daughter cry into my shoulder for as long as she needed to. Her son's name was Miles. He was 5 years old. He was sitting in the kitchen eating crackers and watching something on a tablet when Renee brought me inside, and he looked up at me with the straightforward, uncomplicated curiosity that only small children manage and said, "Who are you?" Renee crouched down next to him and said, very carefully, "This is your grandfather, buddy. This is my dad." He looked at me. He said, "Grandpa Gene?" I didn't know she had told him about me. I didn't know she'd kept my name alive for him, kept me real in some form even while she believed I was gone. I said, "Yeah, buddy, that's me." He considered this for a moment, with the gravity of a 5-year-old weighing important information, and then he went back to his crackers. That made me laugh, for the first time in a long time. I didn't tell Renee everything that night. There would be time for that. What I told her was enough. I was alive. I had been alive. What she had been told was a lie, and the person who told her was the same person who was currently profiting from the home she lived in and the labor she provided. I asked her if Warren was at the property. She said he had been there earlier to check on the event setup and had left. He rarely stayed for the events themselves. He came and went and collected checks and left her to manage things. I asked her to trust me for a little longer. I asked her not to contact Warren or say anything to anyone at the reception. I told her the people were already working on this, that it was moving, that the most important thing was that she and Miles were safe, and that she knew I was alive. She said, "Have you been? For 4 years. Where have you been?" I told her. All of it. The facility. Gordon's house in Durham. The attorney. The records, the filings, the slow, grinding work of proving that I existed, that I had been robbed, that the person entrusted with my care had instead dismantled my life. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I kept wondering why everything felt like a loan. Like I was always one conversation away from being told to leave. I thought that was just grief. I thought I was just waiting for the other shoe." She hadn't been wrong. She just hadn't known whose shoe it was. Warren was arrested 11 days later. The Financial Crimes Unit had been building the case alongside our civil filings, and by the time they moved, the documentation was solid. The fraudulent power of attorney, the false death representation which carries its own criminal weight in North Carolina when used to commit fraud, the deed transfer, the business dissolution, the 4 years of event revenue generated from a property he did not legally own. His attorney, a different one from the man who'd helped him set up the trust, that one was under a separate investigation, tried to characterize it as a family misunderstanding. a well-meaning response to a genuine medical crisis that had perhaps been mishandled. The judge at the preliminary hearing looked at the documentation for a long time before she looked up and said she was having difficulty characterizing systematic fraud committed over a period of years against an incapacitated family member as a misunderstanding. Warren did not make eye contact with me in that courtroom. I did not try to make him. The civil proceedings ran alongside the criminal case and took longer, the way these things always do. Harriet was methodical and thorough, and she had seen people like Warren before. People who mistake patience for weakness right up until the moment the door closes. The trust was dissolved. The deed was restored. The revenue Warren had collected from events at the property was calculated and became part of the damages claim. It wasn't about the money. I want to be clear about that. I had enough between the judgment and the insurance recovery on the business assets to live without worry. It was never about the money. It was about the 4 years my daughter spent making herself small in her own home. It was about Miles growing up without a grandfather because someone decided my existence was inconvenient. It was about the particular cruelty of using a person's grief. Renee's grief for her father, her grief for her mother before that, as the mechanism of the theft. That I cannot forgive. I haven't tried. Renee and Miles are living in the house now. Actually living in it, the way it was always meant to be lived in. Shoes by the door, drawings on the refrigerator, the particular noise of a child running on hardwood floors that I never got to hear when Renee was young because we lived in a smaller place then and she ran everywhere on carpet. I moved back in the spring. I have the bedroom at the end of the hall, the one with the east-facing window that catches the light early. I watch the sun come up over the ridge most mornings with a cup of coffee, and I think about what it means to start over at 63. I think about the 4 years that were taken. I think about the way Miles said Grandpa Gene like it was a word he already knew, like I was already real to him. I do not spend much time thinking about Warren. There is a moment when you have been robbed of something and then had it returned, where you have to choose what to carry. You can carry the theft. You can rehearse it, re-examine it, measure every remaining hour of your life against what was taken. Or you can put it down. I'm not going to tell you it was easy. I'm not going to tell you I don't still wake up some mornings in the early hours with a particular kind of anger that has no clean place to go. I do. Probably. I always will. But I walk downstairs and there are Miles's shoes by the door. Always in the wrong place. Always exactly where you'll trip on them. And Renee is usually already up, drinking coffee at the kitchen table with one leg tucked under her the way Susan used to sit. And the ridge is going gold outside the window, and I think, this is mine. This was always mine. Nobody is ever taking it again. If there is something I would tell anyone who finds themselves where I was, stripped of everything, trying to reconstruct the proof that you exist, that you are owed what you are owed, it is this. Do not let the size of what was taken make you believe recovery is not possible. The fraud was enormous. The process of undoing it was slow and exhausting, and there were months when I genuinely did not know if it would work. But it worked. Not because I was powerful, because I was patient, and because I found people who knew what they were doing and trusted them, and because I refused to disappear. Warren counted on me disappearing. That was his only real mistake. A man's worth is not measured in what he allows to be taken from him. It is measured in what he refuses to let go. I refused to let go of my daughter. I refused to let go of my name. I refused to let go of a home I built on a mountain ridge in North Carolina with my own 2 hands, stone by stone, year by year, for a life I intended to keep. That life is still here, so am I. I've had a lot of time to think about how this all happened. Not just the fraud, the mechanics of that, I understand well enough now. I mean the deeper question of how a person ends up standing in their own driveway, a stranger to everyone on the property, while their daughter carries a tray of drinks for paying guests 20 feet away. The answer, when I'm honest with myself, is that I trusted the wrong person for too long and never asked why. Warren had been borrowing from me in small ways for decades. Not just money, time, credibility, the benefit of the doubt. I kept extending it because he was family and I had confused loyalty with wisdom. Those are not the same thing. Loyalty is an emotion. Wisdom is a discipline. I was loyal without being wise, and that gap is exactly the space Warren walked through when I was lying in that hospital bed and couldn't stop him. I don't say that to blame myself for what he did. What he did was his choice, and he is answering for it. But I say it because I think there is something true in it that took me a long time to see. The people who take from us are rarely strangers. They are almost always people we have already decided to trust without examining why. Warren didn't break into my life. I had left the door open for years. What I keep coming back to, though, is Renee. She lost 4 years. She lost them not to a stroke, not to an accident. She lost them to a deliberate lie told by someone who looked her in the eye at what she believed was her father's memorial and let her grieve something that wasn't true. That is a particular kind of cruelty. It requires a person to look at someone else's pain and decide it is useful to them. The thing about that kind of cruelty is that it eventually collapses under its own weight. Not because the universe is fair. I don't know that it is, but because sustained deception requires sustained effort, and eventually the effort shows. Warren had to keep Renee close enough to be useful but dependent enough not to ask questions. That is an unstable arrangement. It requires constant management, and the longer it runs, the more it costs the person maintaining it, in attention, in energy, in the small daily work of keeping a lie alive. He was already showing cracks before I came back. Renee had already started to notice the feeling she described, that everything felt like a loan, that she was always one conversation away from losing even what she had. She was right. She just didn't yet know the shape of what she was sensing. I think about Miles saying Grandpa Gene like it was already a familiar word. Renee had kept me alive for him in some form, even through her own grief. That was intelligence and love working together. She didn't know I was coming back, but she didn't let me disappear from her son's understanding of the world. That matters. That kind of quiet persistence, holding on to something true even when the evidence around you says otherwise, is the thing that I most want Miles to understand as he grows up. Not anger. Not revenge. Persistence. The refusal to let someone else's version of your story become the final one. I am 63 years old. I lost 4 years. I have whatever comes next, and I intend to use it. The ridge is still there every morning. Miles's shoes are still exactly where you'll trip on them. And I am still here, which is the only thing Warren ever needed me not to be. He miscalculated. That's enough for me.